It is a place of fantasy, of drama, of spectacle. Craftsmanship and materials come together with the human spirit to allow us to suspend our disbelief and to be transported into another world outside ourselves. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conventional theater in the United States was going through an upheaval. Cinema was on the rise, and the sensational melodramas of the theater were now fodder for the big screen. Playwrights tried experimenting, using new narratives with more realism. And although different than its melodramatic live counterpart, vaudeville provided a variety of acts and entertainment to stimulate the senses. However, the allure and the economics of the silver screen were dimming the luster of even this wildly popular medium, with some vaudevillians defecting and taking their act to the moving pictures. Live theater was struggling to find its place. In 1895, owners of most of the theaters across the United States formed into a theatrical syndicate. They controlled the wages, the expenses, and the competition. But more importantly, they controlled the content. This led to a dramatic decrease in the level of experimentation and stifled creative theater for many years, as producers and theater owners only produced shows that would realize the highest of profit margins. Young theater practitioners around the world were desperate for a change. They wanted a place where new ideas could grow, a place where experimentation could take place without the constraints of profit-driven methodology. Out of this desire, the Little Theater movement was born. The Little Theater provided an atmosphere where artists could experiment with new plays and new techniques without the worry of public affinity or commercial success. Tradition was frowned upon and experimentation was welcomed. Little theaters sprang up across the country, not out of financial backing, but rather the desire for art and expression. They performed in gymnasiums, barns, social centers, and other suitable places. These little theaters, sometimes referred to as civic theaters, came from groups of people who were a cross-section of the community. People interested in creating their own theater for the good of the community in which they lived.
Peoria was a theater town. People liked going to the theater. That pattern had been established, and we had traveling companies that came in, but we didn't have local community theater.
The phrase, "Will it play in Peoria?" initially developed not as a test market phrase because we were the average community, but because we were the most critical, discerning audiences. And if it would play here with our discerning audiences, it could play anywhere. If it could pass muster in Peoria, Peoria should be very proud of that phrase if we really drill down into the history of it. It meant we were sophisticated in our understanding of the power of storytelling in theater.
I didn't know about Peoria, a kid growing up in Chicago, but that phrase I was aware of. And the fact that you had wonderful theater houses where large, venues of chorus and stars came to perform kind of opened the door for the community theaters to exist as they do today.
With cinema on the rise and vaudeville on the wane, there was a need for creativity in this Midwestern town. On a brightly moonlit June night in 1919, 25 eager, creative Peorians gathered on the sweeping lawn of the William Hawley Smith home. Throughout the evening, there was impassioned discussion about potential directors and theater locations, as well as the shows that were just waiting to be produced. But out of all the debate came the determination to form a players group, which would be made up of amateur actors, writers, painters, and all manner of stagecraft. The name of the organization would be known as the Peoria Players. The Players made an open call to find all the interested talent Central Illinois had to offer. Some of the talent would develop into consummate actors, articulate playwrights, and discerning directors. Others would develop into skilled technicians who could design, build, paint, light, and design costumes and makeup. But before any play could be presented, the players needed a stage. The Peoria Women's Club in downtown Peoria had just the answer. On the second floor of their building was an auditorium that could seat approximately 450 people. It was clean and afforded the players a good cultural center from which to demonstrate their early talents. A rental agreement was drawn up and show preparations began. On the very first opening night, the audience crowded into the expansive auditorium for 50 cents a ticket. Perhaps it was significant that the first show produced was a one-act fantasy entitled The Maker of Dreams. It was simple, but the cast of 3 performed it with such imagination and insight. Little did they know how indicative the title would be of all the dreams that would be realized by Peoria Players for years to come. The 1919-1920 season realized 7 performances, with a total of 16 one-act plays and 1 two-act play. Peoria's Little Theater was well on its way. By the end of the 6th season, 75 plays had been performed. Enthusiasm and membership were on the rise, and at no time did the theater operate in a deficit. At one point in 1925, though, there was only 35 cents left in the treasury. That was only because the growing organization had purchased their first big blue cyclorama curtain to line the back of the stage. By the end of that 5th year, discussions were already taking place about the need for a theater space of their own.
We were trying to use their theater while they had their own activities that they were doing there too. And there were other times when we would have to go to other venues in town to do a show because there was a conflict with their space. In addition to the fact that since it wasn't ours, since it wasn't the theater's, we didn't have backstage storage space. It was theirs, so we had to just bring everything in as a package deal. Maybe we would get 1 or 2 rehearsals there before we could do the show.
The Women's Club facility, though adequate for Peoria Players' early years, was never designed to do live theater. The dressing rooms were merely distant bathrooms on the first floor, down a long flight of stairs. At the time, the lighting was little more than temperamental footlights, and there was little to no room off stage for scene transitions. Over the 5 years, enough set pieces had been accumulated that they had to be stored in various places around town. The cost of transporting the necessary equipment to and from the location became a significant expense. Also, with shows becoming more complex, there was a pressing need for rehearsal space. Since the beginning, rehearsal space usually consisted of the director's home being turned into a stage every night for the 4 or 5 week rehearsal period. This tended to be hard on the marriage as well as on the rugs. In 1927, a building committee was formed and worked to find a new space. The Peoria Fire Department had recently built a new central firehouse, which left the original firehouse on Jackson Street vacant.
The fire department was going to abandon that old firehouse, so they began to talk to them about a possibility of buying that. And they were hesitant at first, but the Journal-Star, I guess it wasn't the Journal-Star, then it was a Journal and the Star, were both supporting the idea of selling the old firehouse to Peoria Players. So they agreed that they would sell it to Peoria Players for $5,000 with the stipulation that if the theater folded for any reason, it would revert back to the city.
Timing couldn't have been worse. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Plans for the new building renovation had been estimated at $50,000. The capital campaign realized less than $20,000. When all hope of a new building seemed almost lost, Board President William Whittick had an idea. As a result of the Depression, cost of materials and labor had decreased significantly. He realized that by judiciously paring down the building plans to the essential elements only, and using the $25,000 already on hand, they could begin building. By October of 1932, construction began, and on April 1st, 1933, the dedication ceremony took place. Peoria Players had a stage of their own. On April 17th, the curtain went up on Berkeley Square, the first production in their new home. With this new space, larger, more complex, and higher quality productions could now be realized. The rest of the 1930s and early 40s weren't without their challenges, but the theater continued to grow to meet the desires of the community.
At first, people were just happy to have a theater at all, but after a while then, their tastes began to evolve and develop, but they wanted more professional presentations, costuming, staging, makeup, and so forth. And the theater at the Firehouse allowed them to do that. And you could see in the selection of the plays that they did, they began to do plays by O'Neill and O'Casey and people like that who were highly respected people writing significant plays. And I think that would never have happened at the Women's Club. But with their own theater, they were able to become more ambitious in terms of what they could offer to the public. At the same time, the public was really demanding that. They wanted more and better stuff.
Then came World War II. World War II took a lot of men off to the armed forces, all right? So who's going to be doing these shows? So we had problems trying to staff them or find shows where women can do more than the guys did.
Throughout the war years, not only was it difficult to find players and staff, but audiences dwindled as well. Even though they operated most years at a loss, the theater never went dark. When the war ended, the 1945-46 season was so successful, they were able to place $2,400 into a new building fund. In May of 1947, Peoria Players paid the final loan installment to the city for the current building. That following season was so successful, $7,000 was added to the new building fund. In the post-war years, the demand for shows increased. Membership was again on the rise. The demand for tickets was so high, the run of most shows was extended from 6 nights to 8 nights. In the mid-1950s, a new system of interstates was being developed across the country. Peoria would have one that would pass right through downtown, right through the scene shop of the theater.
And it was going to take off a section of the Firehouse, a section of our theater. So we began to look around for what we're going to do. We're going to have to move. We can't stay here with the road running 50 feet from the back of our theater. So, and we were really lucky then in one respect that the city at that time was looking to create an arts center out in what was then called Lakeview Park. Well, it made sense if you're going to have an art center to have a theater.
Work began immediately on plans for a new community auditorium. As the Players would have to vacate the old firehouse by the end of 1955, and the new building would not be completed until the end of 1957, plans had to be made to accommodate the productions during that time. For the remaining shows of the 1955 season, Peoria Players returned to their original location at the Peoria Women's Club. The 1956-57 season might have brought an end to the theater's record of continuous operation, were it not for some very determined company members.
In the transition between the Firehouse and the opening of the theater in Lakeview Park, we had no place to do our shows, so we became almost a traveling theater. We did shows in high school theaters. We did shows in Old Silko Hall. But technically, we were not dark, and that's the thing that allows us to say we were continuous, because there was never a year when we did not put on plays.
Finally, On November 30th, 1957, Peoria Players opened their new theater facility with Tea House of the August Moon. This new building offered the volunteers something they had never had before, a purpose-built facility specifically designed for stagecraft. There was an expansive stage, larger dressing rooms, a green room and makeup room, and booths specifically designed for the operation of lighting and sound systems. There was now an orchestra pit and an even larger scene shop area with more space to store props and costuming. A new children's theater was added to nurture budding performers who would someday return as adult players. The possibilities seemed endless. However, by the mid-1960s, Peoria Players' financial picture looked bleak. A foreign war, an assassinated president, and civil unrest all made going to the theater seem a bit socially irresponsible. There was a growing feeling of uneasiness, and productions were not selling out as before. The hope of retaining the heavily mortgaged building began to seem like an impossible task.
Interest in the theater just sank to bottom. I think people felt in these serious times, in these times of such chaos, that going to the theater seemed almost frivolous, you know. And it came to the point where they couldn't even find people who direct the plays. They couldn't get people to be in the plays. And if people don't go to the plays, your money dries up, and we couldn't even sustain the building. And at that point, it was sold to the Park District, which then became responsible for the maintenance of it and so forth, but the theater rented it back from the Park District, and that's the situation we have even today.
Relieved from this financial burden, Peoria Players could flourish once again. The organization's finances continued to grow. The auditorium was air-conditioned, the lobby was remodeled, and Players' now signature lighted marquee was installed in 1976. Later, a scholarship fund was established to provide financial help for college students who were pursuing an interest in theater. Decade after decade, Peoria Players has continued to fulfill its mission. But a theater like Peoria Players does not persevere for 100 years on its own. It requires people. It requires the countless volunteers who give of their time and talent to make the magic backstage and on stage. These are friends, neighbors, and co-workers. People for whom the power of putting on the show drives them to their best.
Well, when I was a young girl, there were icons in this community that were involved in community theater, and we all looked up to them, and we all emulated them, and we were pretty starstruck, really, by them. And, of course, they were people like Pat White and Jerry Johnson, Bonnie White, Mel White, Michael Dentino, Ron Pilon, people that just had an instinctual love and affinity for the stage.
The involvement of youth has been a really spectacular change, really. We went from very small cast children's theater to CCT, Children's Community Theater, our own youth theater, and now there are several of them on our board, and they have contributed so much to that theater that it's like your minor league team now is on the pro team. They're starting to make things happen.
But a show is so much more than the 2 hours spent in seats of the auditorium opening night. Whether you're constructing sets, building costumes, or performing for the audience, countless hours are devoted to the craft that will light up the stage for the run of the show.
I have always admired the fact that these individuals take so much time out of their daily routine, and they spend hours upon countless hours to make sure that a venerable old theater like Peoria Players continues running.
It is hard work to do a play. It truly is, whether you're directing it or working behind the scenes or whether you've got a lead role or whether you're in the chorus. It consumes a good 6 to 8 weeks of your life.
And by the time that show opens, or by the time it closes, it's a very family-like unit by that time, and people love that. I love that. Everybody loves that, to be a part of that group. And that's why some people will just go from one show to another to create that that feeling again. Other people, professional people, have to really budget their time and shift activities and so forth to be able to make that kind of a commitment. So everybody has their reason for wanting to do it.
Out of these experiences, friendships develop. Some grow into bonds that carry beyond the walls of the theater.
It's just fun to see friendships develop. We have people that have never done shows before, and they do one because they maybe like the show or like the music in the show, and then they're hooked, and they come back time after time, and it's just a joy to watch people get involved that way.
We've had, I don't know how many, I know at least 3 or 4 different individuals who met there and ended up getting married after being involved with the theater.
Something like Peoria Players, which has managed to last for 100 years, didn't last because the original people are still in it. It lasted because generation after generation met people, had fun, enjoyed it, and talked about the next generation joining it. And 100 years later, here we are.
There are 4 generations of Bourlands that have walked the Peoria Players stage. The first was my dad's mother, Mrs. F.B. Bourland, and she was very active in the early history of the theater, as was my grandfather, her husband, Frederick Bailey Bourland. Then my dad, who was asthmatic and kind of sickly, she involved him over at Players because she felt that that was the kind of activity. He wasn't good at sports and he couldn't do them, and she got him interested in set design and scenic design and things like that. And while he was over there, he met my mother. So my mother and father and my grandparents all walked that stage. Then I did, and then my son, Eric, was in The Music Man. So I think there aren't too many other families, if any other families, that have had 4 generations active on that stage, but we have.
Peoria Players thrives on volunteerism. Throughout the years, there are countless reasons why people choose to become players, and why those volunteers return again and again.
Peoria Players is so important to me because it provides a place to do what I love the most. I mean, let's face it, outside of, when you leave high school and maybe college, that's really probably the last time you get to do anything fun like this. It's probably the last time you get to be on stage and to act and to dance and sing. I think for most of us, we don't go into it professionally. And so a community theater like Peoria Players gives us the chance to do what we love.
I liked it as a little kid. I liked it in my 20s, my 30s. Best part is playing a jet, but it's being in front of the lights. It's having your ego stroked, and it's being around a bunch of friends and growing with more friends.
And once I got involved, I just got hooked, and I love it, and I actually really want to go to Broadway.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun. I've met a lot of great people, friendships, and it's an artistic outlet for myself and a lot of other people. And you know what? You learn something that you haven't done before, like how to juggle fire or how to do numerous other things. But I do it because it's in here. It's getting to getting down to the heart of things.
I remember going out on that stage and feeling that audience, the live audience, and there we were, just kids, school kids, but carrying those instruments. I think I played the saxophone, or pretended to play the saxophone in The Music Man, but being out there on that stage and knowing that the performance was counting on us.
From the beginning of time, the most culturally diverse and renowned cities have had at least one thing in common: art. Since its inception, the mission of Peoria Players has been to enrich Central Illinois, giving citizens an opportunity to not only watch great dramatic art, but to have the chance to be part of something larger than themselves.
Throughout human history, the constant thread is storytelling. And performance has been a part of human history since we can measure it. Storytelling helps us to carry through values, points of view, and information that's vital for each new generation and for different diverse groups of people to understand each other.
It builds your personality. It brings parts of you that maybe have been suppressed for years. It brings them out. It gives you a confidence in front of people.
To have an organization like Peoria Players that struggles to stay alive for 100 years, it really adds to the growth and development, the humanness of our young people. That is the main reason I'm glad there is an organization like Peoria Players in existence.
A community is what the cultural arts organizations are to that community. It's what gives the community its own identity. And I've always said, if you look at the Chicago suburbs, they're wonderful communities, but they don't have their own institutions. They're dependent on other places for that. Peoria, because of our location, we've created our own cultural environment. And I think it's made us very strong. Not only does it provide affordable opportunities for our citizens to participate in the arts, but it also provides affordable opportunities for our citizens to view the arts.
You know, when you think that Peoria Players is turning 100 years old, and not just 100 years, but continuous, every year they had a playbill. That's an accomplishment. That's commitment.
Peoria Players has been one of the base of my civic pride for living in Peoria my entire life. With the exception of 5 years in the Windy City, show me another community that has backing of sports, concerts, major venues, and year-round live theater. That's, you know, in the great state of Illinois, you'd be hard-pressed to find all those things at once. And I think Peoria Players has kind of, for me, been the foundation of that for decades.